Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, fellow writers, fellow readers, wherever in the world you're joining from, and welcome to the 2021 Women's Prize for Fiction Virtual Shortlist Festival. We are absolutely thrilled to be here. We're thrilled to have so many people from all over the world, but we're particularly delighted to have all 6 authors who will be joining us over the next 3 evenings to talk about the 6 exceptional novels that are on the 2021 shortlist. All of you know, I feel like I'm telling you things you know here, but the Women's Prize was set up 26 years ago now to celebrate and to honour and to amplify exceptional writing by women, writing of originality, excellence and accessibility, and to put a range and diverse range of voices into the hands, books by amazing writers into the hands of readers that appreciate them. And in the past 26 years, millions of copies of Women's Prize for Fiction books have gone into tens of millions of readers' hands, into libraries, into schools, into bookshops all over the world. And we are thrilled to be able to bring this to you virtually again, because although, like everybody, we had to adjust last year and started to do things online, we also wanted to carry on doing that because, of course, the thing is, by doing this, it increases the access. There are many people who wrote to us and saying they were carers, they couldn't join in, they were in other countries, they couldn't join in, and please could we keep these virtual events? So we're thrilled that we're able to do that. So the Women's Prize is now a charity in the last couple of years, the Women's Prize Trust, and I know many of you have already donated to us to help us carry on our charitable work. If you fancy donating, I'm sure somebody is typing a message into the box as I speak in the Q&A or the chat, but every support is very, very welcome, because obviously we'd like to continue doing much, much more work in terms of access, in terms of encouraging diverse voices, in terms of reaching out to people who have maybe not yet had a chance to engage with the Women's Prize, or indeed any prizes that are out there. This year, our main initiative, if you like, was something called Discoveries, which was a huge program to try to encourage the writers of tomorrow, whatever age they are, wherever they come from, whatever genre they're writing in, whatever their focus and their priorities. And I'm delighted to say that we had thousands of entries. It was powered by NatWest and in association with Curtis Brown and Curtis Brown Creative. And we last week announced our very first winner, Emma Van Straten. Every single author on the 16 strong long list and then the shortlist is going to be giving mentoring from Curtis Brown and their agents, because the idea is entirely to reach out to people who don't think that they have got a chance of getting published. But what we all get as readers, the wider the range of people published, the more exciting our lives are as readers. So we're really grateful to that. Before we launch into this evening, I also, of course, would say we're very grateful to our sponsors, Bailey's and NatWest, and to all of our partners who help keep the Women's Prize going. It's been a long old year, as you can imagine, but now we're here to celebrate the best, and these 6 novels are absolutely exceptional. So those of you who've been to our festivals before know the drill. We've got 3 nights. Each night I'm going to be talking to 2 of the authors on the shortlist. I'm doing it in alphabetical order by surname, so there is no other reason for the pairings than that. And what we're going to do is be listening to readings from each of the novels, then I'll be talking to the authors, then there'll be a little bit of discussion between the 3 of us, and then it will be your chance to ask questions. So if you can save them up and then start to put them in the Q&A box, people behind the scenes, brilliant, Rosie and Jen and Claire will send them through to me, and we can put your questions directly to tonight's guests. And they are the amazing Brit Bennett and the extraordinary Susanna Clarke. So before I introduce Brit and ask her to, in the old days, I'd say come onto the stage, but obviously I mean turn her camera on. But before that, we're going to hear the extraordinary Ruth Negga reading from The Vanishing Half. Ruth, over to you.
When Desiree Vignier waved at her daughter's bus from the terminal, she waited until the Greyhound disappeared around the corner to wipe the tears from her eyes. She didn't want the last thing for her daughter to see, if she had in fact been staring out the back window, to be her silly mother crying as if she'd never see her again. Early handed her a handkerchief and she laughed, dabbing her eyes. I'm fine, she said, although nobody had asked, and she wasn't. After he dropped her by Lou's egg house for her shift, she realized, tying her apron, that she was starting her day the same way she'd started it for the past 10 years, except that this time she did not know when she would see her daughter again. 10 years. She had been home 10 years. Sometimes she glanced around the house, shaking her head, as if she still didn't understand how she'd found herself back. As if she were in the Wizard of Oz, but instead of a house dropping on her, she'd fallen through the roof and wakened years later, dazed to realize that she was still there. When she'd first decided to stay, she gave herself practical reasons. She didn't earn enough at Lou's to live anywhere else. She couldn't abandon her mother again. She still hoped that Stella might return home on her own. And even if Stella didn't, Desiree felt closer to her here, wandering around Stella's old things. The chair where Stella sat at the table. A corn-husk doll Stella named Jane. Everywhere around the house, a door handle or blanket or couch cushion that Stella had once touched, bearing the invisible remnants of her fingerprints. She'd made a sort of life for herself here, hadn't she? With her mother and her daughter and Early Jones, who left and continued to leave, but also continued to return. When he visited, Desiree felt like a girl again, the years falling away like meat off the bone. His arrivals always seemed a little miraculous. Once she was carrying a country fried steak and eggs to a table and found Early sitting at the end of the counter, chewing on a toothpick. Another time, she locked up the diner and turned to see Early leaning against the phone booth across the road. She was exhausted, but still laughed at the sight of him, as unexpected as the sudden coming of spring. One day there was frost, and the next, bloom. "I was just thinking about you," he'd say, as if he'd stopped by on his way home, not driven all the way from Charleston, pressing on through the night, bleary-eyed to get to her sooner. Wondering what she was up to. She was never up to anything, of course, but her days blending together into a sameness that she found comforting. No surprises, no sudden anger, no man holding her one moment then hitting her the next. Now life was steady. She knew what each day would bring, except when Early appeared. He was the only thing in her life she wasn't prepared for. He never stayed longer than a day or two before he was gone again. Once, he'd convinced her to call in sick to Lou's so that he could take her fishing. They didn't catch anything, but halfway through the afternoon, he kissed her, slipping his fingers under her dress, stroking her as they floated on the glassy lake. It was the most thrilling thing that had happened to her in months. When Early came to town, her mother grew grim and tight-lipped, glaring at the door when Desiree slipped out to meet him at the boarding house. "I don't know why you're fooling around with that man," she said. "Can't stick around, find no decent work." "He works," Desiree said. "Nothing decent," her mother said. "Probably got all type of women out there running after him." "Well, that's his business, not mine." She didn't ask who Early spent his nights with outside of Mallard. He didn't ask her either. Each time he left, she missed him. But she wondered if his leaving was the only reason why they worked. He wasn't a settling man. And maybe she wasn't a settling woman either. When she thought about marriage, she felt trapped with Sam in an airless apartment, bracing herself through each calm moment for his inevitable rage.
Hi, Brit. I don't know what it's like to hear your work being read out loud. I'm sure you read it yourself, but welcome and thank you for your absolutely beautiful and magnificent novel. Are you in LA? Is that where you are at the moment?
Thank you. No, I'm in New York right now.
New York, right. Okay. So maybe not so hot or,
No, it was raining today. It was terrible.
Oh, no, well, that's good. You're making us English feel much better. We normally have the rain. Just before we start, many people will have read The Vanishing Half. It's an extraordinarily beautiful and successful book. And of course, in America, it's been #1 in the New York Times and was Good Morning America book club. But for those people who haven't yet read the book, could you just give us a little précis about what the book's about and where the inspiration came from?
Yeah, The Vanishing Half is about twin sisters, Desiree and Stella, who grow up inseparably and then decide to live their adult lives in two different worlds. One is a white woman and one is a Black woman. And yeah, some of the inspiration came from my mom, who grew up in rural Louisiana and introduced me to the idea of these types of Creole communities that were very obsessed with color.
And one of the things that I found so extraordinary, the idea of colorism, the idea that some people are blacker and that's looked down on, and some people can pass for white. And of course, that happened quite a lot in the jazz era. Did you always think that you needed to make it twins, that it needed to be Desiree and Stella? Is that where the novel came from, the idea of these two girls who made the different choices?
Yeah, I think they were always twins in my imagination. I think twins are such a fun way to think about questions of identity, and particularly to think about the absurdities of race, the idea that these are two women who look identical to one another, and yet they experience two completely different realities based on how they are perceived and also how they identify racially.
And of course, I loved the layering of relationships of mothers and daughters, and the daughters in the next generation, because you go from the 1950s to the 1990s. So it's a huge, epic sweep of a novel. So when you had this idea of the two girls, and that at 16 they were going to make different choices, they were going to go different ways, did you have a roadmap of where you thought the novel would go, or did you just let the girls take you?
No,
you know what
roadmap.
I mean?
I know. I wish I'd had one. No, it was totally chaos. I knew that they were going to end up in different places. I kind of had a general idea of some of the geographical span of the novel, but when I first started writing it, I did not expect it to become a multi-generational story. I thought the book would just be about the twins. I didn't expect it to go forward in time as far as it goes. So the book really felt like it just kept kind of sprawling and growing and getting away from me as I was working on it. But I decided just to follow that and to follow whatever seemed interesting to me at the time.
And did you, what Stella and Desiree, are they the characters you imagined? As a writer myself, I sometimes find I have a really clear idea of a character until I start writing her. And then she's like, I'm not like that, you've made the choice. So how far away from your original ideas were the two girls?
I think that they became two different people. I think particularly when you write about twins, I think there can be a sort of knee-jerk impulse of the characters in the book, and also sometimes use the author to be like, this is the outgoing twin, this is the quiet twin, or to sort of categorize them into some type of dichotomy. And I think that was kind of the original dichotomy that I had, was Stella's the quiet one, Desiree's the outgoing one. But then their lives became so much more complicated when I started imagining that section that Ruth just read was, later into their lives than I really thought about the book going. So to think of what are these women like in middle age? What are the choices that Desiree is making later in life that are different maybe than the choices she expected to make? And all of those ways the characters became really different than the kind of neat and simple way that I originally imagined them.
I thought it was just incredibly skillful, the way that my sympathies changed. To start with, I was really on Desiree's side. I thought, she's with her twin, and then her twins kind of abandoned her, and the pain of not knowing what had happened to her twin. But then I started to feel, you do it so cleverly, and I won't give anything away, but I also started to feel a huge sympathy for the choices that Stella had made, and this fear of essentially being unmasked, the idea of having passed for white, and now suddenly she's going to be found out. I thought that was terribly clever. I couldn't decide whether I was Team Stella or Team Desiree.
Thank you. I had that experience, I think, writing the book too. I knew that Desiree would be our entry point into the world, and I knew that readers and myself as well, our initial sympathies lie with her, but that also was part of what was so interesting about the mystery of Stella, of discovering what her life has been like since you've seen her and what she's been up to, and seeing that the life that she's living is also very different than the life that Desiree has imagined that she's living.
And the multi-generational, you said that you hadn't originally expected it to be multi-generational. Was that something that for you as a writer gave you kind of ambition, I suppose, that you realized that it wasn't enough to tell the beginning of that story? You needed to follow it through to the consequences on the next generation down.
Yeah, I don't know if I even thought about it like that. I loved
Right.
the feeling that it felt like the book kept restarting, and it felt like the book kept revealing itself to something that was new, even to me as I was writing it. I enjoyed that, I think, as a reader, but I also enjoyed writing the book because of that. So I think that was mostly what I was kind of chasing, was seeing what these characters are going to be like years down the road, or having mention of a character and then seeing them years later, that type of experience. I think it's something that I just love as a reader. So I had a lot of fun trying to create that same experience.
So, a final question for now, before we come back with Susanna as well. In terms of your writing process, this is a hugely ambitious novel. I mean, everything that has happened to it is so deserved, and it's been a huge bestseller in the UK and many other places in the world, not just America. When you have a first draft, how long does that take you, and how much rewriting do you do, or refashioning of the? Are you going to make me really sad by saying none and it's just perfect?
Oh.
If you say that, I'm going to have to just turn my camera off and weep.
No, I mean, I'm trying to remember, because it felt like so many drafts.
Right.
This book took me 4 or 5 years to write, and a lot of it was because of the scale and scope of it. I hadn't planned out to write a book that was going to be quite so sprawling, and I had no idea how to do it. So it took many drafts to try to figure it out, and just to realize that I was writing a book that was going to be a little bit bigger than what I originally anticipated, and that I had to afford myself the freedom to sort of wander down these side streets, even though maybe they didn't lead anywhere.
Yeah.
I had to sort of take those chances in figuring out this book, because it just ended up being a bigger and more complicated book than I imagined writing.
And it's not just the time span, but it's also the geography. So we have the very strong sense of the Southern community, and Mallard, the town, this, as you said, the Creole town, where the color of a person's skin is very relevant to how they're perceived. Is that a real place? Is it somewhere that's based on a real place? How did you, because I felt Mallard itself was a character, actually. It made me want to go there.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was based on real places. My mom is from rural Louisiana, and she would tell me about towns like this that she grew up hearing about. And there were some that I did research on and found, random sort of historical documents from 1930s or whatever that was written about these types of places. So I drew on both that historical research, but also largely my mother's memories of just growing up in the rural South, in order to create this town and give it this kind of larger than life sort of personality that casts this huge shadow on all of the characters who pass through it, and even some characters who never set foot in it. They're still affected by this place.
Yeah. Well, I can imagine, I mean, that there would be people in their map, with their maps going, well, where is Mallard? It's so real on the page. Probably people are out there looking for this town now. So I assume that there'll be a film. I hope there'll be a film, and in which case they will build Mallard. They'll build Mallard, won't they? You're going to be an architect as well, Brit, as well as everything else. It is the most magnificent novel, and it's such a joy to talk to you. And don't go away, because we're going to hear from Susanna and a reading from Piranesi, but then it'd be great to talk to both of you together. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
So the second author that we have this evening is Susanna Clarke, with her novel Piranesi. And to read from Piranesi is the musician and actor Jordan Stephens. So over to you, Jordan.
Entry for the first day of the 5th month in the year that Albatross came to the southwestern halls. When the moon rose in the 3rd northern hall, I went to the 9th vestibule to witness the joining of 3 tides. This is something that happens only once every 8 years. The 9th vestibule is remarkable for the 3 great staircases it contains. Its walls are lined with marble statues, hundreds upon hundreds of them, tier upon tier, rising into the distant heights. I climbed up the western wall, until I reached the statue of a woman carrying a beehive, 15 meters above the pavement. The woman is 2 or 3 times my own height, and the beehive is covered with marble bees the size of my thumb. One bee, this always gives me a slight sensation of queasiness, crawls over her left eye. I squeezed myself into the woman's niche and waited until I heard the tides roaring in the lower halls and felt the walls vibrating with the force of what was about to happen. First came the tide from the far eastern halls. This tide ascended the easternmost staircase without violence. It had no colour to speak of, and its waters were no more than ankle deep. It spread a grey mirror across the pavement, the surface of which was marbled with streaks of milky foam. Next came the tide from the western halls. This tide thundered up the westernmost staircase and hit the eastern wall with a great clap, making all the statues tremble. Its foam was the white of old fish bones, and its churning depths were pewter. Within seconds, its waters were as high as the waists of the first tier of statues. Last came the tide from the northern halls. It hurled itself up the middle staircase, filling the vestibule with an explosion of glittering ice-white foam. I was drenched and blinded. When I could see again, waters were cascading down the statues. It was then that I realized I'd made a mistake in calculating the volumes of the second and third tides. A towering peak of water swept up to where I crouched. A great hand of water reached out to pluck me from the wall. I flung my arms around the legs of the woman carrying a beehive and prayed to the house to protect me. The waters covered me, and for a moment I was surrounded by the strange silence that comes when the sea sweeps over you and drowns its own sounds. I thought that I was going to die, or else that I would be swept away to unknown halls, far from the rush and thrum of familiar tides. I clung on. Then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. The joined tides swept on into the surrounding halls. I heard the thunder and crack as the tide struck the walls. The waters in the 9th vestibule sank rapidly down until they barely covered the plinths of the first tier of statues. I realized that I was holding on to something. I opened my hand and found a marble finger from some faraway statue that the tides had placed there. The beauty of this house is immeasurable, its kindness infinite. Entry for the 7th day of the 5th month in the year that Albatross came to the southwestern hall. I am determined to explore as much of the world as I can in my lifetime. To this end, I have travelled as far as the 960th hall to the west, the 890th hall to the north, and the 768th hall to the south. I have climbed up to the upper halls, where clouds move in slow procession and statues appear suddenly out of the mists. I have explored the drowned halls, where the dark waters are carpeted with white water lilies. I have seen the derelict halls of the east, where ceilings, floors, sometimes even walls have collapsed, and the dimness is split by shafts of grey light. In all these places, I have stood in doorways and looked ahead. I have never seen any indication that the world was coming to an end, but only the regular progression of halls and passageways into the far distance. No hall, no vestibule, no staircase, no passage is without its statues. In most halls they cover all the available space, though here and there you will find an empty plinth, niche or apse, or even a blank space on a wall otherwise encrusted with statues. These absences are as mysterious in their way as the statues themselves. I have observed that, while the statues of a particular hall are more or less uniform in size, there is considerable variation between halls. In some places the figures are 2 or 3 times the height of a human being, in others more or less life-size, and yet in others only reach as high as my shoulder. The drowned halls contain statues that are gigantic, 15 to 20 metres high, but they are the exception. I have begun a catalogue in which I intend to record the position, size and subject of each statue and any other points of interest. So far I have completed the 1st and 2nd southwestern halls and am engaged on the 3rd. The enormity of this task sometimes makes me feel a little dizzy, but as a scientist And, as an explorer, I have a duty to bear witness to the splendours of the world.
Listening to that amazing reading, Susanna Clarke, welcome to the virtual stage. I felt when I was reading this extraordinary novel, I quite often felt almost dizzy, like I was flying through the stars reading it. So before we start to have a bit of a Q&A, could you just try to explain for people who have not yet read Piranesi, you know, a little bit about the novel and where the idea came from?
Absolutely.
Can you do that? Go on.
That was a fabulous reading. As was explained, Piranesi, the narrator, lives in a house in which an ocean is imprisoned, and as far as he knows, it is an infinite house, and as far as he knows, it is pretty much all there is in the world, apart from the sun, the moon, and the stars. And everything else is inside the house. And he loves the house. He's a strange character in that he is extraordinarily happy to be in the place where he is. And as far as he knows, there is only one other living person in the world who is his friend. And it's the story of his explorations and also of how things start to get a bit darker.
I loved the fact right at the beginning you have a quote from The Magician's Nephew, C.S. Lewis.
Yeah.
And it's not my favourite, that's The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, but it is almost my favourite of the Narnia books. Was that an inspiration in terms of the idea of creating an entire universe that had its own rules and regulations? And in a way, we couldn't say that it was anything to do with our world because it was utterly different. Is that where partly that came from?
It's definitely part of the inspiration with C.S. Lewis. It's the Narnia books, as for many fantasy writers of my age, were my favourite books as a children, and kind of not only shaped my idea of what fantasy is, but also shaped my idea of what books ought to be. And so definitely The Magician's Nephew was a strong influence, but the other influence, the sort of beginning, the seed from which Piranesi grew, was the stories of Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentinian writer who wrote these tiny little jewel-like stories, but often described quite strange worlds, like there's a world which is nothing but a library. And then in another story, he describes the original labyrinth, but from the point of view of the Minotaur. And way back in my 20s, I was living in London, and in those days, you could do an evening class on almost anything in London.
Yes.
And there was an evening class on the stories of Borges. I don't know why. And I decided to go, and it was fabulous. There was just this small group of people, and we'd just sit and discuss these stories. And I think it was out of that I started to write this slightly Borgesian idea of a house that contained an ocean and the two characters. So I've still got about 7 pieces of paper with typewritten with this attempt at a story, but it didn't go anywhere, so I sort of just put it away for a while.
So what did you put it away for a while? So then was Piranesi, as your narrator, you know, an explorer, a scientist, as you say, a really unusual character in that he is happy and there is joy in everything that he says, and he sees the other every week and they are friends, and there is that, you know, that's, but was it that Piranesi himself, this narrator voice, was kind of in your head and that's why you went back to the book? I mean,
no, not at all.
How did it happen then?
The thing that I knew about the house was there was this house, and there was one character who understood how the tides worked and one character who didn't, and he kind of needed the other one to explain to him what was going on in the world, how the tides worked, where it was safe to go, where it wasn't safe to go. And that was really all I had for a long, long time. And I came back to Piranesi because after writing and publishing Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, I became very ill with chronic fatigue syndrome. And there came a point where I felt I ought to be able to write again. I wanted to write again. And I had all these bits on my computer that are still there of various different things, various different projects. But I felt I needed something manageable, something quite sort of small that didn't involve a huge amount of research, which this didn't, because I couldn't think what I would research. I tried researching clouds at one point, but that didn't seem to go anywhere. So that was why I came back to it. But even then, the character of Piranesi wasn't clear to me.
Really?
And it was only once I realized that he was a happy person, that he was actually having, in a strange way, a wonderful time, and that he felt so completely at one with the house and the place where he lived. It was only at that point that things began to roll forward.
And as often in fantasy writing or alternative universe writing, it is about creating an entire world, and you do this so beautifully. The house is beautiful and a character in its own right, but then you do introduce an additional person into this perfect environment. So was that, as you wrote, you realized that you needed some, you know, not grain of sand, but you needed something to slightly upset the balance of it, I suppose?
I could have gone on just describing the house forever, but kind of, at a certain point you think, well, now something had better happen, I think, at this point. So yes, I knew that there was going to be some form of disruption. And it begins with actually not just one, but two people appearing, not immediately, but over time, and the way the dynamic changes, and also Piranesi's sort of very serious efforts to understand how they might fit into his sort of map of the world.
One of the things that I loved about the novel is the beauty of it, the beauty of the sentences and the beauty of the structure. There is it's very melodic, it's musical in many ways, and it's laid out beautifully on the page. In a way, it's the same question I asked to Brit in terms of your process. You've said that you were unwell after your wonderful 2004 novel, Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, which was longlisted for the Man Booker, shortlisted for the Whitbread and the Guardian first book, won a British Book Award. So you had that first novel that exploded the world, and there is a pressure that comes with that. So when you started to find your way back to writing and getting a joy in it, did you write a whole first draft and then sit back and think, okay, what have I got here? How did it end up the book it is?
I have this terrible confession to make. I don't write first drafts.
What?
I don't write second drafts. I don't write third drafts. I don't write in drafts at all. I write a paragraph here, a sentence here, and it's a very, I don't recommend this way to anybody. It's just the only way that I can write. Someone said to me on Sunday, well, you have to write the way you can, not the way you should. You know, just if that's the way you can write that way. So I write, it's sort of a bit like taking dictation from somebody who's down a corridor in another room or something. There are bits missing, but gradually I sort of have to piece it together. I suppose in the end I do end up with a sort of a draft, which I then sort of comb through, but most of the work is done. By the time it's all fitted together, most of the work is done.
It's like the idea of the moving finger writes and moves on, isn't it? You know, that sort of almost automatic. But once you have then a pile of paper, I won't call it a first draft, was this the book you thought you were going to write? Did you know it? You know what I mean? Sometimes you kind of know a book, and other times you're like, huh.
I think what I found both with, I mean, Jonathan Strange and Piranesi have very little in common, but that's one of the things that I found was that towards the end, you start to recognize it, and you start to think, yes, this is, in some ways, this is completely different from what I thought it was going to be. But in another way, there is something here that I recognize. There's a sort of atmosphere almost. Yes, there is.
And it looks like you. It looks like your voice. Yeah.
It looks, I can see the connections with all the things that I wanted to bring in. That I think that's what it, all the things that kind of excited me, that I wanted to describe, that they're in there now, I hope.
Yes, and before I ask Brit to come back to join us, and I know we're getting lots and lots of questions, and do keep them coming, everybody. You know, we're going to have time to get through quite a lot, I hope. Did you enjoy it? You know, having come back to writing, having been unwell, did you enjoy the process of writing?
At the end, I enjoyed it immensely.
Good.
Yes, I did enjoy it. It was in some ways, I mean, the reception for it has been fantastic and much more than I expected. But in some ways, the greatest thing for me is that I managed to finish another book when I really didn't know if I could or not. And I think that has been the biggest joy.
And what a book. I mean, it's just not another book. It's an extraordinary and beautiful and haunting novel. And I think, as you said, Jordan's reading was extraordinary. Brit, I hope you're still there in New York, and Susanna is in Derbyshire. So, you know, we are covering the globe in a way. So I'm going to come to the audience questions in a moment, because we've got a lot coming through. But I'm just going to ask that mean question, because I'm an author too, so I feel I'm allowed to do this. You both have had, this is a second novel for both of you. You obviously had a collection of short stories as well, Susanna, but you both had very successful first novels. The Mothers for you, Brit, in 2016, and we've talked about Jonathan Strange and Mr. Novel in 2000. Mr. Norrell. I always call him Mr. Novel because that kind of makes sense, really, isn't it? Yes. Mr. Novel in 2004, and there's obviously a bigger gap for you, Susanna. But could you both just say for the audience, is that a pressure? If you've written one hugely successful book, do you feel pressurized by the idea of readers sitting waiting? Or are you able to shut the door and just think about the words on the page? Maybe Brit, if you could answer that first.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in a way I did feel some pressure because, you know, I think you write a debut novel with just complete freedom. There are no expectations. There's no one who's waiting for it. Nobody knows who you are. There's just that type of freedom that I think is different once you've gone beyond a debut novel. So I was aware of that. But I think a lot of the process of writing this book was trying to shut that door and not thinking about what people liked about the first book or what they disliked. I think both of those are kind of unhelpful. So I tried to just focus on the fact that I was writing a completely different thing, and that I was also doing something I had never done before, which was writing a second novel. It's just it felt like a different experience to me for sure than writing the first one.
Yeah. And Susanna, you said a bit about that because of the longer gap, but did you have a sense of people waiting?
I think I would have felt that more intently if I'd managed to finish a book within 4 or 5 years of the first one being published. But one of the good things about a decade-long illness, and there are a few good things about it, is that other people's expectations do become pretty irrelevant at that point. And it wasn't the book that people were expecting. It was something completely different. So I felt, in that way, I felt free. Yes.
Yeah. Yes. And that's quite interesting, that there was a liberation in the fact. The thing I rather love is lots of people saying it's a lot shorter. That seemed to have surprised people. They were expecting a good old chunky one, and they didn't get that. Right. We've got loads of questions, so I'm just going to rattle through them. I'm going to start one from Sarah Mahoney for you, Brit. She says, "I love Early as a male character. How did you come to create him?"
Thank you. I loved Early too. I knew
we
that
all love Early.
I knew the book would have a sort of detective-like figure in the story who's kind of chasing down part of the central mystery, which is, where is this missing twin? So I knew that. I didn't think he was going to take up such a big part of the book. I didn't think that he was going to be a character who would become part of Desiree's family, and I think that was really surprising to me. But I love the idea of this being a character who's kind of a mercenary, and he doesn't want to be involved in people's lives, and then he finds himself kind of wrapped up in the mystery of this family.
Yeah, lovely. Susanna from Layla, she says, why did you decide to structure the novel in journal entries? Was that always your intention? In a way, you've answered that, but about the journal entries particularly.
I didn't always intend that. I didn't know how it would be written. I think one of the breakthrough moments was when I realized it had to be all from Piranesi's point of view. It made so much more sense. And then, because he's a scientist and a scholar, and he loves minutiae, and he loves being very, very precise, and so it made sense then for him to start to write it as a journal. And also the way that he writes, the way he structures the dates that he gives things, it sort of intensifies the fact we are not in this world. We are in a completely other world with somebody who's thinking in quite a different sort of way.
Yeah, it gives us something to hold on to in a way, doesn't it? For Brit, Anna Rafferty says, her heart was broken for Adele, the twins' mother, after everything she had been through, and yet I recoiled against her colour obsession. She'd love to hear just a little bit more about her.
Yeah, I mean, for me, Adele was this character who really represented the values of this town. You know, this is a woman who has bought into them wholesale and is trying to pass them on to this next generation. And I wanted to be honest about that, of what that looks like, but also at the same time considering the context of her life in a way that didn't justify what she was doing, but did give you that complicated feeling that you had as a reader. Where like Adele's a character that I did like, but she does these, you know, and sort of propagates this really horrible ideology that she has bought into. So to me, she was the character who kind of represented that. She represents the values of this town. And, you know, one generation down, we see the twins who are going in two different directions, who are both rejecting the ideology of the town in two very different ways.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely lovely. And the nuance of that, it's really important, because it then doesn't become a kind of, it's not simple, is it? You know, the choices aren't simple. Susanna, Katie says, where would you rather spend more time in your alternative worlds? Piranesi's labyrinth of halls, or the magical world of Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell? And I said it right. Mr. Norrell. I got it right, finally.
Perfect. Probably, I don't know. I think I would love to go to the house, Piranesi's house. I feel I almost felt that I was there when I was writing it. It was quite a strange experience in some ways. So I desperately would like to go there.
The real house.
To the house, yes. Yeah. But I don't know. Would I want to go to Jonathan Strange? Yeah, probably as well. I don't know. It's a very difficult decision.
Yeah,
I think Piranesi's house.
There we are. But it's a wonderful question. The idea that these places are so real in her mind that there's a choice for you to make when actually they're in your head. So that's a wonderful thing. Brit, Victoria says, how, if at all, has the Harlem Renaissance influenced you as a writer?
I think that some of the great passing novels come from that time period. You know, obviously Nella Larsen's passing, that was a big book for me that I was thinking about as I wrote The Vanishing Half. It's a story about these two women who have a very fraught friendship, one who passes for white and one who chooses not to. And the sort of fraught kind of psychological thriller that story becomes because of the choices that both of these women make. I think that I consider that to be part of the architecture of The Vanishing Half. And I think that's one of our most renowned novels from that time period. So I think in a lot of ways, I think a lot of the concerns of Black writers in that time are still some concerns and questions that I share in my own work.
Yeah, that's great. And I hope, I mean, I'm sure everybody's noticing within the chat that we're putting up information, not just obviously about the wonderful readings and of course about Brit and Susanna, but any other books, we're going to try and put those in there as well so that you can, I mean, you've got to buy Piranesi and The Vanishing Half first, but then you can buy other books as well. Susanna, Beth says, the horse, this is going so well this evening. It's the horse, it's the novels, I can barely speak, terrible. The house yes. And the halls you've created are so complex and so beautiful. Did you map it out? I mean, physically map it out on a page, or is it absolutely in your head, expanding as you go?
It's definitely not in my head. I did a map of the halls which are most mentioned, which are the ones surrounding the first vestibule. I did map that because that helped me think how in Piranesi's mind, because he's numbered every single place that he's ever been to, and he has it in his head. I haven't got it in my head. I also did some sort of vaguer maps, some kind of, not really maps, but just diagrams, so that I had some idea of how the vestibules, which are numbered in a different way, relate to the halls. And also, when there are floods, which halls would get flooded, because all of this had to be, so I did it as precisely as I could. But it sounds not very precisely.
But it sounds like it, in the way, it's the way that you write, that you don't need the whole thing written down. You need the bits that you want to know about written down.
Yes, yeah. I'm sure that, and I think that's true of fantasy in general. People get very sort of worried if worlds don't exactly, you know, if there are details that are contradictory, but that's not really the way writers work. You work with what you've got in front of you.
That's true. I mean, but I'm afraid I'm a writer that, you know, if there's a map, I'm sold. As long as there's a map, I'm happy. I like to know where I'm. This is a question from Daisy for both of you. Which writers do you take inspiration from? Apart from Nella, you just mentioned. Brit, are there other contemporary writers maybe that you do, not just the ones that influence your own writing?
Yeah, I mean, I think contemporary writers I love Jesmyn Ward, Dorothy Allison, Colson Whitehead, so many writers that I admire who I think are doing really interesting work formally and also asking really interesting questions in their work. And some older authors are people like Toni Morrison, or Neil Hurston, James Baldwin, people who I think have proved themselves also to be fluent across form and medium. That's also something that I really admire in all of those writers too. That's
interesting. So you actually particularly admire writers who are very versatile in the different genres and areas that they write in.
Yeah. I think so. Yeah. A lot of those writers wrote screenplays or essays or just, comic books or whatever other types of forms. That's something that I admire. I think it's cool to see writers kind of branch out and do television or do all of these different types of things nowadays. I admire to see people doing that.
Yeah, I always think, because quite often a story tells you how it needs to be told, and that might be a play, and it might be a short story, and it might be a novel. It's not always, the form.
Exactly.
Yeah. What about you, Susanna? Are there particular writers, particularly if you, at the time you weren't writing, were you reading during that time, or were you tired of words, I suppose?
both, I think. I had long periods of not reading at all. One of the writers that I discovered during that time was Diana Wynne Jones, who is sort of a children's writer. Well, she's definitely a children's writer, but some of her books, she definitely wrote the book that was suggested to her, and I don't think took a great deal of notice about conventions for adult writers or for children, for adult readers or for children. And she just has the most fabulous imagination. It just pours out of her. I also love the person who influenced C.S. Lewis was George MacDonald. The Princess and the Goblin, the Princess at the Back of the North Wind, wonderful books. And then also comic writers, people like Neil Gaiman and Alan Moore, very much so.
Yeah, it's interesting. So that you both read in a way in the area where you write as well. So that's quite it. Because I find when I'm writing, I write mostly historical fiction. I cannot read in my area because I find other people's voices are too big for me. So I read crime when I'm writing because it's not what I do. And I don't worry about their voices getting in my head instead.
No, I also read a lot of crime. I mean, the people I've discussed are the people who have influenced me or who I would like to influence me in the case of Diana Wynne Jones, but I also read detective novels.
Good. And what about you, Brit? Do you read in your area as well? Or do you know what I mean? I mean, it's sometimes when you're writing, it's just other people that you admire in your head is not helpful.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I like to do both. I like to read, like if I'm writing about a certain topic, I like to read other things kind of around that topic because I find it interesting and generative. But I also then want to read something that is a departure and read something that feels very different than what I'm interested in. So I'll try to balance it, I think.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's an obvious question because we're running out of time and the questions have been fantastic. Thank you all so much. You both, there was a question from Graham Fulcher about the second novel after a debut novel that was so successful and you've both answered that, which is great. But I'm kind of going to push you slightly further now on the third novel. You're both in, I'm sorry, I'm not being paid by your publishers, I promise. But it's, in a funny sort of way, you've both achieved something quite unusual because that, the cliche of the second album, the second novel, it's a cliche because it's quite often true. Whereas you've both produced exceptional second works as well and very different works. So in terms of writing on, do you allow yourselves just to be proud of these books and what you've done? Or are you already thinking, yeah, but I've got an idea for this or that, the other? I'm asking now shamelessly as a reader. I'm abusing my position as the host of this event because I would like more books from both of you. So what about you, Brit? Do you have that sense of where you're going to go next, or are you just enjoying the Vanishing Half?
Yeah, I mean, I've been working on my next project. I've been working on it throughout quarantine. So, I've been kind of looking ahead, but I think there is maybe a little freedom for a third book because you don't have the proximity to a debut, and you also don't have the sophomore slump kind of threat hanging over you. Like I don't know any stereotypes about third books, so maybe that will be a more freeing experience because I don't think that there are expectations one way or another of what a third project looks like. So yeah, I've been looking ahead, working on this next project, struggling with it, back in the trenches again at the beginning of a new project. So it feels good it's challenging and frustrating at times, but it also feels really good to be moving on to a new fictional world. Yeah,
and not sitting on your laurels. And Margaret Atwood always calls it working in the word mines. And I love that idea because it's the idea of dusty and dirty and you can't quite see where you're going, and then suddenly there is the moment. Susanna, you've been very honest about the period of time that you weren't writing. Has this made a difference writing Piranesi? Do you feel that you have another project burbling away, or are you just at the moment enjoying this book?
I think one of the problems with having such a very long illness is that I've got lots of projects, and one of them I hope one of them, I hope, will be the third book. My health is still uncertain, so I'm working when I can, and no, I think there's a lot of pressure, but not pressure from the outside. Well, pressure like there's things that want to come out, definitely, and some of them are sort of in the realm that I've worked in before, and some of them are quite different. I feel excited about all of them. So yeah. I think I always feel that when a book's been published and it goes out, and it's sort of like they've left you a bit. That there are kind of, it's lovely to see their success, but they've kind of grown up. They've gone out into the world. They kind of don't need you anymore, which is good.
No, Joanna Trollope once said to me that it was like standing on a railway platform waiting for the train to come in, the process of writing a novel and publishing a novel. And the train comes into the station, you get on, and for the duration of the journey, you sit in that carriage with those people. And then you get off because you've finished the book, you've done it, and the train goes on without you. And I think that's a great description, because the book's out in the world now, they belong to the readers as much as anyone else. I think we are incredibly lucky to have these two extraordinary novels on the shortlist. Everything about the Women's Prize was about ambition and extraordinary fiction and works of art, and writers being free to write what they wanted to write, but that readers would discover a jewel every time they joined one of these calls or whatever. You've both been so wonderful this evening, and thank you very much. I wish that we were all about to be in a shared space, but I don't think we are quite yet, but we'll see how it goes. But for everybody who's been on the call, your questions have been absolutely great. All the information about where you can get Piranesi and also the Vanishing Half, and of course a bit more information about both Brit and Susanna, and indeed Jordan and Ruth, and the readings is in the chat. And if you want anything else, go to the Women's Prize for Fiction website, where everything about all the shortlist is there. We're going to be back tomorrow night. Not Susanna and Brit; they're allowed off. They've got books to finish, ladies and gentlemen. They've told us that now. So I'm going to hold them both to it, because we can't wait that long. That's all I'm saying. We can't wait that long. But I will be back tomorrow with Claire Fuller, and also who will be, her book will be being read by Juliet Stevenson, and Zoe Ashton will be reading Yaa Gyasi's Transcendent Kingdom, and we will be talking about those books, and then moving towards, obviously on Wednesday, we will have the last two books, which will be Jada Nuka reading from How the One-Armed Sister Sweeps Her House, and Hayley Atwell reading from Patricia Lockwood's No One Is Talking About This. For now, I'd just like to thank everybody behind the scenes at the Women's Prize who worked so hard to bring this to everybody. I'd like again to thank the sponsors, Bailey's and NatWest. I'd like to thank all of you, the audience, for engaging so openly with all of us and for your questions. And I've already told you to buy the books, and why wouldn't you? If you haven't, you've let us all down. So just go straight there to the website now. And thank you, all of you, apart from anything else, who donate to the Women's Prize for Fiction, so that we continue to be able to set up projects to encourage diversity in writing, to encourage a wider range of people to feel that they've got the right to put their voice out there. And that's what the Women's Prize is all about. So Susanna and Brit, you know the drill. It's so boring. We can't say goodbye privately. So I just have to say a huge thank you for joining us. We will obviously carry on following with great interest to what you do next. But it's great to have you part of this celebration of the Women's Prize for Fiction virtual shortlist. And to everybody else, have a wonderful rest of evening, and we will see you tomorrow. Good night, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Bye.